What would you do if a stray dog started following you and refused to leave? Would you ignore it, or would you stop to understand why? That's exactly the situation Officer John found himself in after finishing a long and exhausting shift. All he wanted was to go home, but as he walked through the empty streets, a small, scruffy dog trailed behind, mirroring his every step. At first, he thought it was just another stray, until he noticed something unusual in its eyes. There was urgency, almost desperation. When he reached down to check its collar, he made a chilling discovery. Tucked inside was a crumpled note. John carefully unfolded it, his pulse quickening as he read the shaky, childlike handwriting. "My brother is sick. No food, no water. Please help. Apartment 3B. Instantly, his exhaustion vanished. He glanced at the dog's pleading eyes. It was as if the animal was urging him forward. Someone needed help. A child alone. His training kicked in. Stuffing the note into his pocket, John straightened and scanned the dark, empty street. The dog let out a small whimper, then turned and started trotting ahead, as if leading the way. His gut told him this was no ordinary welfare check. As he neared the rundown apartment complex, an unsettling feeling crept over him. The dim streetlights flickered, casting eerie shadows, and the security gate dangled uselessly from its hinges. Something was terribly wrong. John's instincts screamed at him as he stopped in front of apartment 3B. He knocked firmly. No answer. He knocked again, harder this time. Silence. It felt off. Too still. Too heavy. The little dog whined and scratched at the door, ears perked. John's unease deepened. Something was very, very wrong. Taking a step back, he braced himself and slammed his shoulder into the door. The flimsy wood cracked, the lock giving way under the force. The smell hit him instantly, a suffocating mix of stale air, unwashed clothes, spoiled food, and something worse. His flashlight cut through the dimness, revealing peeling wallpaper, an overturned chair, and a heap of blankets in the corner. And then he saw them. A frail boy, no older than 8, sat curled up against the wall, his arms wrapped protectively around a baby. John's breath hitched. The boy wasn't just thin. He was starving. His cheeks were hollow, his oversized clothes dirty and worn. His cracked lips trembled as he clutched the baby tighter, shielding him from an invisible threat. The infant lay frighteningly still, his tiny chest rising and falling weakly. His skin was flushed, his tiny fists barely moving. Sick. Weak. John could tell instantly. The boy didn't cry, didn't speak. He just stared, wide-eyed and fearful, like a trapped animal. Slowly, John knelt, lowering his voice. "Hey, kid. I'm Officer John. I'm here to help." The boy shrank back, his small body trembling. How long had they been alone? How long had this child fought to survive, with nothing but sheer will and desperation? John's chest tightened. There was no time to waste. His training told him to assess the situation, but his heart screamed at him to act now. The baby's breathing was too shallow, his skin too pale. The older boy, his brother no doubt, held him so tightly as if letting go would mean losing him forever. John spoke gently. "Hey, buddy, your brother needs a doctor. We have to go, okay?" The boy flinched, his grip tightening. Mistrust, fear. He had been alone too long. John took a steadying breath. "I promise I won't let anything bad happen." For a moment there was only silence. Then, finally, a slow, hesitant nod. That was all John needed. Before we continue, I'd like to ask you to like this video and subscribe to our channel. It really helps us out. Thank you. John gently lifted the baby into his arms, startled by how light he was. Fragile, malnourished, weak. The older boy clung tightly to John's jacket, as if afraid to let go. The little dog barked once, then took off ahead, leading them down the crumbling staircase. Outside, John radioed for an ambulance, his heart pounding. Sirens wailed in the copy distance. The boy's tiny fingers twisted into John's sleeve, his breath shaky. "You're safe now," John murmured. But as he looked down at the frail baby in his arms, he knew this fight wasn't over. At the hospital, John sat beside the boy in the waiting area, his knee bouncing anxiously. He had seen neglect before. He had seen abandoned kids. But something about this case, about this boy, felt different. The child sat stiffly, fists clenched in his lap. His clothes hung loosely on his small frame, his worn sneakers riddled with holes. How long had he been surviving like this? John exhaled slowly. "What's your name?" The boy hesitated, lips barely moving. "Ethan." John nodded, his voice soft. "And your brother?" "Gabriel," the boy whispered. "The baby. The one who had barely been breathing when John found them." John clenched his jaw. "Where are your parents, Ethan?" The boy hunched his shoulders, as if bracing for something. He swallowed hard, his voice barely audible. "They left." A quiet, simmering anger tightened in John's chest. Ethan stared at the floor. "A few weeks ago," he mumbled. "They said they'd come back, but..." His voice broke. He sucked in a shaky breath, blinking fast. "They never did. Weeks. This child, this 8-year-old, had been alone, taking care of a sick baby for weeks. No food, no water, no one to turn to." John's fists clenched. "No kid should ever have to endure that." "Did they leave you anything?" he asked carefully. Ethan shook his head. "Just a note." His voice was hollow. "They said they'd find help, that I had to stay strong." John exhaled sharply. "Stay strong. They hadn't gone to find help. They had abandoned them." Leaning forward, he placed a steady hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You don't have to do this alone anymore." For a long moment, Ethan didn't move. Then slowly, so slowly, his tiny fingers uncurled from his fists. He wasn't sure if he believed John yet, but for the first time in weeks, he wanted to. John never planned on taking care of 2 kids. But after that night, there was no way he was letting them go back to an uncertain fate. Ethan and baby Gabriel were placed in emergency foster care, but something about it didn't sit right with John. The thought of them in a stranger's house, frightened and alone, gnawed at him. So after a flurry of late-night calls and stacks of paperwork, John did something even he didn't expect. He brought them home. His apartment wasn't exactly child-friendly, but he made do. A crib for Gabriel in the spare room. A makeshift bed on the couch for Ethan. The first night, Ethan barely spoke, just curled up with the little dog, Charlie, as John started calling him. The next morning, John attempted breakfast. It did not go well. Smoke detectors blared as he waved a towel frantically over a pan of charred pancakes. Ethan covered his face, but not before John caught a glimpse of something. A small, fleeting smile. "I hope you don't cook like this every day," Ethan muttered. John sighed. "Not usually, but I had to impress my new roommates." Ethan shook his head, biting back a grin. Charlie wagged his tail, happily devouring the ruined pancakes. And for the first time, John heard Ethan laugh. 10. 16. Weeks passed. Slowly, Ethan began to open up. He was still quiet, still guarded, but little by little the walls came down. He no longer flinched at sudden noises. He even started setting the table without being asked. Then one afternoon, the knock came. John opened the door to find a woman standing there, disheveled, hollow-eyed, unsteady. "Where are my kids?" she demanded, her voice cracking. "I came back for them." Ethan froze. His face went blank, but his hands curled into fists. John stepped between them. "You left them," he said, his voice firm. "For weeks, no food, no water." Tears welled in her eyes. "I was trying to fix things," she whispered. "I didn't mean to." Ethan's voice, small but strong, cut through the moment. "You weren't going to come back." She flinched. Ethan looked at her for a long moment, then slowly moved behind John. That was all John needed to see. He turned back to her. "You need to leave." Her lips parted as if to argue, but then she just turned and walked away. That night, Ethan didn't say anything, but at bedtime he whispered, "She wasn't going to stay, was she?" John swallowed hard. No, buddy, she wasn't. After Ethan's mother left for the last time, John sat alone in his truck, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even surprised. He was just tired. Tired of seeing kids like Ethan and Gabriel abandoned. Tired of watching children carry burdens they never should have to. Tired of the world letting them down. Again and again. And yet, Ethan still hoped. Even after everything, there was a part of him that still waited. For someone to prove him wrong. To show him that not every adult disappeared. That not every promise was empty. John took a slow, steady breath. His fingers tightened slightly around the wheel. Then he glanced at the stack of paperwork on the passenger seat. The bold letters at the top of the first page seemed to stare back at him. Heavy. With meaning, he exhaled. His chest rose and fell under the weight of a decision that, in reality, wasn't even a decision anymore. It wasn't something he was debating. It wasn't something he had to think twice about. It wasn't a question anymore. It was a promise. Promise that Ethan and Gabriel would never feel alone again. A promise that they wouldn't wake up one morning to find themselves abandoned. A promise that this was forever. That night, John sat across from Ethan at the kitchen table. The adoption papers lay neatly between them, the air thick with unspoken words. John cleared his throat, keeping his voice steady. "I've been thinking," he started, drumming his fingers lightly against the table. "What if we made this official?" Ethan's small frame stiffened. His fingers curled into the fabric of his oversized sleeves, knuckles turning white. His whole life had been a series of uncertainties, of temporary shelters, of people who came and went. Feeling wanted was something he had never dared to believe in. He swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper as he cautiously pulled the papers closer, his eyes scanning the unfamiliar words. You really want to keep us?" The vulnerability in his voice nearly shattered John. John felt his throat tighten, emotions swelling in his chest, something he couldn't quite name. There wasn't an ounce of hesitation in his response. More than anything, Ethan's gaze lifted, searching John's face for any sign of doubt, any hint that this was just another well-meaning promise waiting to be broken. But he found none. John's expression was steady, certain. And then, Ethan nodded. It was such a small moment. So simple, and yet it carried the weight of an entire lifetime. In John's arms, Ethan's thin frame trembled as he clung to his shirt like it was the only thing keeping him from drifting away. No hesitation, no resistance, just raw, desperate relief. He had been strong for so long, too long. And for the first time, he didn't have to be. For the first time, Ethan wasn't just surviving. He was home, and John. He finally understood what family really meant. The day the judge finalized the adoption, Ethan never let go of John's sleeve. When asked the big question, "Do you want Officer John to be your father?" his voice was strong and sure. Yes. John signed the final papers, sealing what they had already become. A family. That night, the house was livelier than ever. Charlie barked with excitement. Gabriel chattered happily in his high chair. And Ethan, sitting at the table, smiled freely for the first time. John placed a plate of spaghetti in front of him. "Tonight, we celebrate." Ethan twirled his fork in the noodles, raising an eyebrow. "You sure you didn't burn anything?" "This time?" John feigned offense. "Excuse me, but I happen to be a professional chef now." "Uh-huh." Gabriel clapped his hands, giggling as Charlie attempted to steal a meatball from his tray. Ethan's laughter filled the room, warm, unrestrained, real. John leaned back, watching the joyful chaos unfold, the kind of chaos that felt just right. For the first time in a long time, Ethan wasn't worried about tomorrow. That night felt different. The house had settled into a peaceful quiet, wrapped in the warmth of a sleepy evening. Gabriel had already drifted off in his crib, his tiny chest rising and falling rhythmically. Charlie was curled up at the foot of Ethan's bed, twitching in a dream. John smoothed the blanket over Ethan's shoulders, tucking him in. a routine that had become familiar, safe. "Good night, buddy," John said softly, standing up to leave, just as he reached the door. "Dad." The word was small, hesitant, as if it had been trapped in Ethan's throat for weeks, maybe even longer. John froze. The air between them grew heavy, time itself seeming to still. Slowly he turned around. Ethan stared at the ceiling, his fingers clenched into the fabric of his blanket. He looked like he wanted to take it back, as if the weight of that single word was too much. John swallowed hard, his voice quieter now. "Yeah?" Ethan exhaled shakily, his grip loosening. A long pause, a moment of quiet understanding, then, barely above a whisper, "Good night, Dad." Something cracked open in John's chest, something raw, deep, permanent. He walked back, sat on the edge of the bed, and placed a gentle hand on Ethan's head. "Good night, kiddo." Ethan didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. He simply let out a soft breath, his body easing completely. For the first time tonight, he chose to believe, and John, he'd never let him doubt it again.